This week on Talking Politics USA, Canada takes on Donald Trump.
They said, listen, we love America. They are our neighbors. They are our friends. They're like cousins, but we don't want to be married to them.
The outrage at the growing Moscow MAGA alignment.
It's frankly astonishing that suddenly the world has turned on its head and they are talking about Putin as not being a bad guy.
It's disgusting. It's appalling. And it's done behind the bully pulpit of the United States of America.
And the painting that has made Trump rage.
Because it looks like several pounds have been added to his face.
Welcome to the podcast in another eventful week where everything seems to be changing incredibly fast. Dan is with us, having just been on holiday. Dan, you took a holiday? What on earth? What's that about? Where were you?
I know, well, there's not much going on, so I thought I'd just, take a few days off. It's, pretty quiet in Washington these days.
Fair enough. Laura Schwartz, former White House staffer, also joins us. Laura, I think of you as one of the most upbeat people I've ever seen or met. And I noticed that the US has slipped down the world happiest rankings. Can't imagine why. In this year's iteration. I wondered what you made of that.
Well, it's not just a one-off. This has been happening for the last 2 years. I am a blood type B positive, Tom, so I am optimistic. But even I can see the reality in this trend. I think Americans, with the financial crisis looming and with uncertainty in the markets, of which they're greatly invested in, they're not so happy anymore.
Okay, well, listen, the general theme this week, as I suspect will be every week in the coming months, is the drastic, rapid and incredibly significant change in the world order that is being pioneered by Donald Trump and his team. Now, let's start with Canada. I mean, there are many places we could start. We're going to talk about Greenland. We're going to talk about the markets. We're going to talk about the potential attacks on the US Constitution and the rule of law. How serious are they or aren't they? But let's start with Canada. Mark Carney has teamed up with Austin Powers creator Mike Myers, of all people, both in Canada ice hockey jerseys, in this campaign video. Let's just have a listen.
Mr. Prime Minister, Mike Myers, what are you doing here? I just thought I'd come up and check on things. But let me ask you, Mr. Prime Minister, will there always be a Canada?
There will always be a Canada.
All right, elbows up.
Elbows up.
For our podcast listeners, that clip ends with Myers' jersey reading Never 51, in reference, of course, to Trump's 51st state chives. Laura, we've got some sense over here of what Canadians are beginning to think of MAGA Americans and Donald Trump. What are Americans thinking about all this?
Well, they're thinking that it's hyperbole, except we do find that President Trump, in his first term, discussed both bringing Canada into the fold of the United States as well as Greenland. And now with what he feels is more of a mandate in his second term, is really taking actions to follow through on that. And there are many Americans, whether they're related or have good friends in Canada, that are very familiar with the term elbows up, which was coined by a great hockey player from Saskatchewan that played for the Detroit Red Wings, led them to 4 Stanley Cup championships, and he was known for being really aggressive against his opponents by putting his elbows up. And so that has become the rallying cry in Canada. And even just yesterday, there was an elbows up rally in Toronto. And it was, it's the Canadian nice. They're always known for being very nice. And they were, even in this rally, where they said, listen, we love America. They are our neighbors. They are our friends. They're like cousins, but we don't want to be married to them. So I think most of Americans kind of get that.
Okay. Dan, I mean, it's so hard often, isn't it, with Trump to work out what's all this about? Did it start as something as a bit provocative and he's talked himself into believing? I mean, to make an obvious point that lots of people have made, in the unbelievably unlikely, not to say impossible, event that Canada did become the 51st state, it's roughly the size of California, it would probably mean that America would never vote Republican ever again, or not for the foreseeable future. So I think just on that level, it's extremely puzzling. It's not clear what, to me, I think, and to a lot of people in Europe, how you're going to benefit as Americans from insulting your closest, oldest ally.
What's interesting is that the effect of this is the precise opposite, really. What's happened is that the Liberals have shot up in the opinion polls. Mark Carney's called a snap election for April the 28th, and now it's neck and neck with the Conservatives. So the Conservatives were way ahead when Trudeau was Prime Minister, but because of the Trump effect, the Trump bump in the wrong way for if you're Donald Trump, the opposite has happened. So it's that sort of law of unintended consequences, I think, that we're seeing with what he's doing in Canada. You know, I was in Canada just before going on holiday, and the sense of betrayal, of shock and anger was really palpable there. People just cannot quite believe that this is happening, how fast this is happening, and that it is their closest trading partner, the United States, that is sort of turned on them in this way.
Trump really is becoming the definitive factor in this race for the next Prime Minister of Canada, which happens in just 5 weeks from now. As Dan mentioned, the Conservatives were up by 20%. Now they're neck and neck with the Liberals. And one of the biggest campaign ads, and we'll see whether it's effective or not in 5 weeks, is comparing Poilievre, the Conservative guy running for Prime Minister, as Trump. And they show him side by side saying nearly the exact phrases as Donald Trump.
Everything is broken.
Everything is broken.
Fake news.
Fake news.
The left-wing censorship regime.
Their woke censorship ideology.
And so if this really works for the Liberals to brand their competitor as a Trump friend, as Trump-like, that may really lay the groundwork for other elections across the world, that if you label your opponent like Trump, you might be able to win. So it'll be really interesting that, you know, we see the Mike Myers ad, this other Made in America ad. We will see whether or not that works in a very short 5 weeks.
I think a lot of people in Europe are sort of thinking, okay, look, I mean, how do the people who voted for Trump think about this? We don't really understand how you can think attacking your closest neighbor is good for you. And then when I looked at the kind of slew of opinion polls that have come out over the last week, they do seem to tell quite a clear story. Trump, very popular on immigration, pretty popular in theory in cutting the budget, the federal budget, pretty popular in theory in stopping the war in Ukraine and getting out of it. But almost everything else, unpopular. The Gulf of Mexico renaming, unpopular. Being too close to Putin, unpopular. The Canada stuff, unpopular. The Greenland stuff, unpopular. Elon Musk, really, really unpopular. And the economy, really not popular so far. Is there a sense, do you think, that the White House is looking at some of these numbers and thinking, do you know, we need to dial down on some of this a bit because this isn't helping us, or do they just not care? And is the bulk of their movement kind of going with them, or are people beginning to peel off?
Certainly behind closed doors, I think there will be increasing concern, particularly on the economy and inflation, about which direction Donald Trump is taking the country. And they are going to be watching these inflation figures very closely because the effect of these steel and aluminium tariffs and a global trade war, what's going to happen in the US is prices are going to start going back up again. And it is the American consumer that will pay those prices, and it is the American consumer that ultimately will decide who wins in the midterms, which is going to be on people's minds coming up next year. So that's going to increasingly focus people's minds. I think with a lot of the other kind of issues, Donald Trump's got this gift for sort of putting his finger on an issue and then going way beyond what anyone really would think is reasonable. And I wonder if inside the administration, at some point, people are going to say, yeah, okay, you've identified some of the concerns of the American people, but the way you are going about handling this is just alienating people and worrying people and unsettling markets.
I think the mega base, you know, loves the red meat. They love it when he's brazenly attacking other countries and talking about tariffs, even though it adversely affects that voter right here at home. But I think it's those independents that went over to vote for Trump because they were fed up about the economy, who are not seeing a good move on the economy, that are starting to pull their support away. It's those Republicans, those never Trumpers that came back to vote for Trump in November because of the economy and immigration, which he does have high marks on immigration, are starting to pull away. So by Trump just blanketing the media and the field with all these executive orders and all of these big statements, and you know, it just serves to kind of confuse the American people, because he says, hey, pay attention to what's going on over here while I do this over here. And I think that's something, you know, 6 months, 8 months from now, in a midterm situation, we might see next year. But right now, he still does have the majority of approval.
A lot of people will be watching interest rates as well, because that has an enormous effect on ordinary Americans' lives, how much they pay for their mortgage on their house or their car loan. And what's happening is, if inflation starts creeping back up because of this sort of global trade war, it gives the Fed less and less room to cut interest rates. Now, Donald Trump inherited an incredibly strong economy from Joe Biden, with jobless lists falling, unemployment falling, with rates looking like they were coming down, inflation was coming down, the stock market was soaring. All of that gradually is beginning to look more and more shaky. And I think, you know, the chickens are going to come home to roost politically if there is not a course correction when it comes to the economy.
I just wanted to move on and look at the way Trump and the MAGA loyalists really have moved away from Europe. Just have a listen to this. Firstly, J.D. Vance on Greenland, and then Trump's special envoy, Steve Witcoff, on Vladimir Putin.
Denmark, which controls Greenland, it's not doing its job, and it's not being a good ally. So you have to ask yourself, how are we going to solve that problem, solve our own national security? If that means that we need to take more territorial interest in Greenland, that is what President Trump is going to do, because he doesn't care about what the Europeans scream at us.
You go to Moscow, and then you wind up meeting directly with Putin. What did you think of him?
I liked him.
Yep.
I thought he was straight up with me. I thought it was gracious of him to accept me.
Yeah.
To see me. You know, in our country, if you don't act like a lemming and just walk off the cliff like everybody else, then, you know, you get attacked.
When you listen to the Steve Witkoff, you know, of this world being interviewed by the Tucker Carlsons of this world, it does feel like a completely parallel universe. Now, I suppose you could look at it and say, look, they're trying to do a peace deal with between Russia and Ukraine. That requires them to butter up the Russians a bit. And, you know, maybe there's no harm in that. That's one version of events. The other version of events is there's just this absolutely mind-boggling shift in American attitudes that is suddenly sees itself as having a lot more in common with dictatorial, oligarchical Russia than it does with democratic, free Europe. I mean, I guess my question to both of you is, which one of those is true, do you think? Dan, why don't you go first?
It is absolutely astonishing when I think back to my time in Ukraine and sort of seeing firsthand the absolutely devastating results of that Russian invasion and the barbarity with which they prosecuted that invasion, that now, just a couple of years later, they are talking like the closest of allies. When Steve Witkoff told Tucker Carlson, "I don't regard Putin as a bad guy," and relayed this idea that Putin was praying for Donald Trump after that attempted assassination, and this portrait as well that Vladimir Putin had commissioned of Donald Trump as a present. I mean, this is all. This is more than just a slight sort of strategic realignment and being diplomatic in order to get a peace deal. This feels like a complete and total U-turn on where America sees itself in the world.
I just wanted to jump in there for a second, Dan, because if I think about the last 5 or 6 years working here in ITV News, one of the things that would really stick out in my mind, and I will probably remember for the rest of my life, was the piece you did. You did a 12 million, basically half of News at 10 one night was taken up by your piece where you painstakingly documented in Bucha the war crimes that the Russian soldiers had been guilty of. And I do wonder when I listen to this and I watch this, what someone like you, who's actually been on the ground, seeing the bodies, seeing the forensics, talking to the victims' families. I just wonder what your personal response was when you see someone like Steve Witkoff saying Putin's basically a great guy.
Yeah, I mean, I had never. I've seen a lot of pretty awful war zones in my career, but that was akin to something out of the Second World War, where you had soldiers going in and summarily executing people, where you had women being raped, Ukrainians being tortured and executed. It was totally depraved, and I think I personally find it quite offensive when you hear these kind of warm, emollient words being used by this administration towards a man who, let's not forget, also has deployed a chemical weapon on the streets of the United Kingdom to take out his adversaries more than once. It's frankly astonishing that suddenly the world has turned on its head and they are talking about Putin as not being a bad guy.
I agree. Dan, it's disgusting. It's appalling. And it's done behind the bully pulpit of the United States of America. This is not an outlier that started a podcast in their basement. This is Steve Witkoff, who's representing America to try to end this atrocity. And to see the White House stand beside his comments, embrace his comments, echo his comments, truly is a slap in the face to our allies, to humankind, to communities. And what I find really difficult here is that there's just not enough of an uproar from American citizens. I am proud to be an American citizen, but there is more of an uproar over grocery prices than the killings and the alignment with Russia. And it's interesting because this weekend, Donald Trump was asked how the peace talks are coming along. And he said, I think it's somewhat under control as far as looking towards ceasefire in Russia. And just hours later, Putin kills through drone attacks in Kyiv and 3 other cities. So Putin is constantly undermining the United States, which nobody's surprised about. It'll be interesting to see how far he can push Trump. And if Trump ever, I just can't see Trump doing anything but, again, lauding praise on Putin and asking Ukraine for ceding territorial areas. And it's just, it's a mess.
Yeah, it's the sort of normalization of the outrageous that is astonishing. That, a few months ago, it would have been inconceivable that we would be in this situation, and is now routine. And it's so routine, actually, that sometimes it doesn't even make headline news anymore. It certainly does on our programs, but the world moves on and people start looking at other stories. But it is astonishing and should be, to right-thinking people, morally outrageous.
Watching a very senior government official from the most powerful country in the world, the leader of the free world, talk like that about a man, I think just for most people in this country, utterly startling. And then the second thing, J.D. Vance on Greenland. I mean, first of all, Denmark has been a very reliable NATO ally. As a point of fact, it lost more soldiers per capita than anyone else in Afghanistan, apart from the US. Not that J.D. Vance appears to recognize that. But I'm sort of interested to know your reaction, Laura, but also where you think it's going. I mean, we've got Waltz and J.D. Vance's wife visiting Greenland, which seems extremely sort of weird and provocative. Is it really conceivable the US will suddenly fly in and start landing troops in Greenland? Is that fanciful? What do you make of it, and where do you think it's going?
Well, on Greenland, during the transition, Trump even said that he would take Greenland by force if he needed to, of which was walked back by his transition office. And since then, Greenland just keeps coming up on his mind. Let's not forget, this guy's in real estate. Size matters. Getting more land and territory seems to matter to him. And the thing is, he said in the State of the Union around March 5th, well, our friends in Greenland can decide their own destiny. And then a week later, he had the NATO Secretary General in the Oval Office, to which he said, by the way, in front of the press, when he was asked about Greenland, he said, yes, we need to annex Greenland. We need to work on that. And I'm going to need your support on that. Well, after which the Secretary General said, we really don't want to be involved in that. We don't see a place for us in that. He just won't let it lie. And now they're sending the second lady, Usha Vance, over for a cultural trip with one of her two sons, one's 7, one's 5. We don't know which one's going, to watch a dog sled race and go to cultural institutions. The White House was asked this last weekend, were you invited to send a delegation to Greenland? Did they ask you for this? The White House didn't answer, but the current prime minister of Greenland did and said, no, there was no invitation for a delegation. I mean, countries visit each other's all the time. That's fine. But there is a lot more to this, because at the same time, the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, is going to go over there too as part of this delegation. So there's just a lot of murkiness here. I mean, obviously, the Trump administration wants to show their power and their prowess by sending a cultural delegation over. That's one thing, but by having the National Security Advisor, no, they want to make a play, and they're going to keep making up reasons for that play. And that's when I think NATO and the EU is going to have to step in eventually.
Is it credible in the final analysis that Donald Trump might lose patience and send some kind of military force in to occupy Greenland? That's my first question. And my second question, if he does it, will the European countries that are in NATO effectively have to come militarily to Denmark's aid?
I just can't see it coming to that. Well, first of all, I mean, Greenland is effectively undefended, and America already has a base in the very far north of Greenland. So they do have a footprint there. But I think this is probably more about mineral wealth, and it's about projecting strength into the Arctic. But you're right, could this come to a crisis where America says, well, we're going to build another base here, and, what are you going to do about it, kind of thing? And that would put, obviously, Denmark in a very difficult position. At the end of the day, it may just have to acquiesce. And probably that is what is part of Trump's calculation, is that if he starts throwing his weight around in this way, ultimately he's going to be able to say, well, we're going to do this. We're going to have your mineral rights. We're going to start a mining operation here. What are you going to do about it?
The one thing I think when we think about boots on the ground, we think boots on the ground, soldiers. Another way to look at it is if the United States went into Greenland and created a power source, because an immense amount of power is needed. We're talking about this for Ukraine as well, in order to mine these rare earth minerals. If the United States said, hey, we're going to become that power source, we're going to build that with our people, our money, our technology, I think that would give the Trump administration a larger stronghold to move forward with their plans to acquire Greenland. But that may be a way in which we see the United States moving versus actual soldiers. I think watching the power in Greenland is going to be a key factor.
Well, one of the things we've talked about most weeks, and I think we're going to talk about every week, is the extent to which Trump is pushing the envelope when it comes to the Constitution, ignoring potentially the rule of law, judgments handed down from courts, and so on. Now, we discussed last week the whole business of these alleged Venezuelan gang members. Of course, we don't know because there was no due process being taken to El Salvador. The attempt by a judge to turn the flight back, the White House ignored that. Then Donald Trump and the White House suggested that the Trump should be impeached. And then we had an interesting moment, I thought, which was that Chief Justice Roberts, the Chief Justice on the Supreme Court, basically said, he didn't name Trump, but he came out with a statement that, we don't do that in America. And as I understood it, the White House then said, oh, no, we're walking that back. Trump, the president, will observe court orders. Now, some people are saying Trump blinked. He's not actually going to push it to an all-out confrontation with the Supreme Court. Others have said, look, he's just backtracking for a few seconds and then it'll attack on the left rather than the right. So I wonder what both of you made of that? Did you, Laura, maybe you first, did you feel sort of encouraged that that was the White House saying we'll take it so far and no further, or do you just not believe that and think, no, that's just a temporary reprieve?
Yeah, I think that's just a temporary reprieve. I mean, we can see that through Truth Social posts of Trump once again ganging up on this justice, who, by the way, the judge that wanted a temporary restraining order on this decision to send people out of the country based on their documented status without due process, as you mentioned, he's the same guy that dismissed the Democrats from getting Trump's tax returns. He's the same guy that was let the Hillary email case go forward. So this is not a Trump-adverse judge by any means, and yet they want to buck the system.
It's sort of looming constitutional crisis, isn't it, that we've talked about before, which critics of this administration would say, well, they now have a completely sort of supine legislature in the form of Congress that seems to be just doing whatever Donald Trump wants. But the other pillar of this country is the judiciary, which should be there to act as a check and balance on the executive. And here is the executive basically saying to a judge, you know, we're sort of ignoring your order and we're going to deport these people, or we have deported these people anyway. And then you've then had Chief Justice John Roberts, you know, pushing back in a very rare public rebuke. As you said, he didn't name Donald Trump, but it was clear for all to see what he was talking about, and essentially said, you know, it's not an appropriate response to a disagreement concerning a judicial decision for Donald Trump to call for the impeachment of a federal judge. But, you know, you do wonder if we are now heading towards an ultimate sort of showdown, really, between the White House of Donald Trump and the judiciary, ultimately in the form of the Supreme Court.
One question a lot of people in Europe have is, where are the Democrats? Where are the Democrats in all this? And I see these town hall meetings seem to be packed with people who are very angry with the Democrats. And by contrast, Bernie Sanders, obviously he's an independent now, but up there with AOC, talking to absolutely packed out audiences, record audiences, as far as I can see, of people frustrated and angry. Laura, I guess that's, you know, a question primarily for you. Where do you think the Democrats are?
Yeah, in the witness protection program. I mean, I don't know. I can't find any. But I will say this: Bernie Sanders and AOC are meeting voters where they are. And if there's any lesson to learn from the campaign and the failed Harris victory from last November, was that Democrats need to meet people where they are. Go out to them. They had over 30,000 in a crowd in Colorado. They had 9,000 in Wisconsin. This is what they need to do, and other Democrats need to start showing up right alongside of them. They need to get a 6, 10, 15-state strategy to get out into the media markets, and not just of Democratic states, which need to be bolstered up, but also go into these areas where Republicans are shying away from town halls. Show them that if the Republicans don't show up, you'll show up, and you'll answer the tough questions, because Democrats are being heckled too. Money talks, and right now the Republicans are afraid to speak up, and the Democrats are having a hard time finding their voice.
Dan, do you think that changes soon? I mean, I've heard so many different sort of perspectives. We've talked in previous weeks about James Carville on one side saying Democrats should just play dead whilst Republicans destroy their popularity. I've heard other people suggesting, no, the Democrats need to get up. They need to get on their feet, as Laura suggests. Maybe they need to tie up with the Liz Cheneys and the Mitt Romneys of this world and the Nikki Haleys of this world and say, listen, this is a disaster for America. We need to fight it. We need to fight it together. I mean, do you get any sense, is there an emerging Democrat central thinking, or just not at all at the moment?
I don't think so. No, I think one of the problems as well in this system is that there is no leader of the opposition like we have in the UK, a sort of figure around which the opposition party coalesces. So it's fragmented, and it means that there is no one really kind of focusing the messaging and targeting their message towards the issues that they think are important and that can inflict political damage on Donald Trump. And also, this is a highly unusual situation that America has found itself in, where the sort of democratic norms are being pushed to the very limits. And so this requires a much more focused, I would argue, approach by the Democrats. And the idea of James Carville's that you just play dead, I'm just not really sure holds water at the moment.
And in that lack of some leaders speaking out, to Dan's point, I would love to see 3 former presidents, President Clinton, Obama, and W. Bush, get out there united to talk about the future of our country. In absence of another leader's voice, I mean, Biden is really not a factor. We saw that, last year. But I think Clinton, Obama, and Bush could make an impact. But we haven't heard loudly from
But Laura, why have they not?
any of them.
George W. Bush, we get the impression, just really, really doesn't, he could have joined Liz Cheney. There's a lot of speculation that, we've seen him rolling his eyes a few times. I don't think there's any serious doubt, is there, about what he thinks? But he seems to have this view that he's a former Republican president and he just can't speak out. I mean, where do you think his head's at? Is there any hint at all of whether he would join the other two?
The constitutional crisis over immigration is not something the American people as a whole are upset about, because they're pro getting illegal immigrants out. But the constitutional crisis as a through line, I think, could be the tipping point for a George W. Bush to want to at least get involved talking about the governing of the United States of America. As far as Clinton and Obama, I don't know if it's that, taking something on like this might be difficult for your legacy that you've built and are continuing to build, that they do want to pass that torch to the next generation of leaders. That'd be one thing if there was a leader out there, but right now there really isn't. And it still falls to the statesmen and women of the party.
Okay, finally, we've just time to bring you this. Amid all the concerns of the world right now, Donald Trump still has time to rage, and I think that's the right word, on Truth Social about a painting of him that's now hanging in Colorado's state capitol building. Trump has decided it's not just an unflattering portrayal, but one that was, quote, purposefully distorted to a level that even I, perhaps, have never seen before. We should make clear that even worse than that, it's by an artist, Sarah Boardman, who previously painted Barack Obama, who, in Trump's words, looks wonderful. Dan, why don't you go first?
Yeah,
how's he got the time?
It's the best painting of Donald Trump. He looks a little bit corpulent. I think that's probably what has offended him so much, is it looks like several pounds have been added to his face, and the notoriously thin-skinned Donald Trump, I think, would find that deeply offensive. So that's perhaps why. And by contrast, Barack Obama looks incredibly youthful and chiseled in his painting, which maybe he was 10 years ago or something, whenever it was painted, but certainly is a bit grayer now.
Well, I certainly wish Trump was just as upset over egg prices as he is over this painting, which has been hanging there since 2019. And by the way, it took a while, because usually it's funded by donors and citizens, and they couldn't get any funding for it. So it went empty for a long time in this national presidential portrait hall at the Colorado State Capitol. So a Republican speaker started a GoFundMe, raised the money, got the portrait painted. We've heard nothing about it. And all of a sudden, Biden's gets unveiled March 1st. And I think that's what all of a sudden called Trump's attention to it. And now it's the center of his universe. Again, I wish the economy was.
If you're listening to this, there's a direct link in the show notes to the video, so you can judge for yourself what the painting looks like. But that is all we have time for this week. I'll be back on Wednesday bringing you our expert reaction to Rachel Reeves' emergency budget that's not called an emergency budget, and other political talking points. And if you haven't had a chance, catch up with our recent Q&A episodes with Robert and Anushka, and do send us your questions at talkingpolitics@itv.com. Until next time, thank you very much for joining us.